Welcome to the party. You found the Mouse Castle Lounge, the place to be for good times and great conversations from the world of Disney. The bar is open, your table is waiting, and drinks are now being served. Come on in. And now, here's your host, the keeper of the Mouse Castle Lounge, Tim Calloway.
Welcome to the lounge. It's May 26th, 2016, and I'm Tim Calloway. We are back, and we've got a terrific show for you today. My guest is theme park historian Robert McLaughlin. But first, amuse yourself with the Mouse Castle's many attractions. Like us on Facebook at facebook.com/The Mouse Castle. Follow me, Disney Tim, on Twitter, and check out the Mouse Castle on Tumblr, Pinterest, and Instagram. Share your questions and comments with us by emailing podcast@themousecastle.com or call our listener line at 702-475-5MCL. That's 702-475-5625. And of course, you can always visit the blog at themousecastle.com, where you can download the free Mouse Castle Lounge app for your mobile device. Just click the pic that says, "Get the app." Long before Walt Disney World opened, and later closed, an elaborately themed entertainment district, there was a Pleasure Island. Before Six Flags operated a hillside full of thrill rides in Southern California, there was a Magic Mountain. These theme parks were nothing like their contemporary namesakes, and their lifespans were frustratingly short. But along with their often-forgotten sister park Freedomland in New York, they hold a special place in theme park history and provide a direct line connecting the game-changer that was Disneyland with Universal, Six Flags, Disney, and other popular theme parks of today. In March, historian Todd Pierce was my guest in the lounge, and he told us all about C.V. Wood, a colorful entrepreneur who was instrumental in the design and development of Disneyland. My guest today, Robert McLaughlin, picks up where Todd left off, because after departing Disney, it was C.V. Wood and his company that designed the Disneyland-wannabe parks of Magic Mountain in Colorado, Pleasure Island near Boston, and Freedomland in New York. They were ideas that looked great on paper, but fell short dramatically when it came to financing and attendance. They were pretty good for what they were, but they were no Disneyland. Bob has written books about all three of these theme parks, and his latest, Magic Mountain, was just released by Arcadia Publishing. Please welcome Bob McLaughlin, my guest today in the Mouse Castle Lounge. How you doing today, Bob?
Hey, Tim, I'm doing terrific. Thanks for having me on.
An absolute pleasure to have you. Now, before we talk about the various theme parks that you have written about, Magic Mountain, Pleasure Island, and Freedomland, I kind of want to maybe throw in a little historical context, particularly what the state of the amusement park or the theme park industry was in the late 50s, early 60s, and really, what was it about Disneyland that made it such a game changer?
Well, up to, going back to the turn of the century, most of the parks around the country a lot of them started out as pier parks or trolley parks. Trolley parks being parks that were built at the end of the trolley line so that the trolley companies could shore up their sales on the weekends. And so they would build a merry-go-round or, rowboats or something to get people to use those trolleys on the weekends. And that's where a lot of your traditional parks started, and so they went all the way through up until until the Disney boys decided to reinvent the game with Disneyland, and up to that point, there was basically it was almost like a carnival effect with mixed match of roller coasters and all sorts of various thrill rides of the day. And then Disney really changed that whole thing with the theming of amusements, and that's where the parks that I wrote about, that's essentially where they were born.
Now, about a month or so back, I had as a guest on my show Todd Pierce, who wrote just an incredible book about the early days of Disneyland called 3 Years in Wonderland. And in that book, he focused on, in many circles, kind of a forgotten person in the whole development of Disneyland, but a gentleman who went on to have a rather interesting career, C.V. Wood. Now, C.V. Wood had his hand in developing these three parks. What was his role, and what was the jumping off point from Disneyland to Magic Mountain?
Well, Wood, and by the way, Todd's a friend of mine, and a terrific book, and somebody should do a movie on C.V. Wood, maybe a musical. Anyway, Wood, if you get to the end of Todd's book, if there's a bottom line, Wood gets fired. He works with the Disney boys putting Disneyland together, and read Todd's book. It tells the whole story. But that's kind of where we jump into this whole thing. So Wood gets fired from Disney, hires a bunch of the guys that he would have been hiring to put Disneyland together, special effects guys, a lot of the guys out of the movies, designers and stuff like that. And so he puts this company together called Marco Engineering. And so their intent was to go out there, and if you're an investor, they would essentially design you a Disneyland-type park, just like Walt and Roy built, or on the concept of it. And and they couldn't lose because they were designing the stuff. So the investors were the ones that were on the hook. They had to raise the capital to build these proposed parks. And so consequently, there was a guy up in Golden, Colorado. Actually, he was in Wheat Ridge, Colorado. A guy named Francis Cobb. He wanted to build a storybook type of a park, children's park, recreation park. And how he connected with Wood, I honestly don't know. There's nobody alive to really get that interview from, but they did make the connection. And so that was Marco's first real commission for what we call a standalone park. Pacific Ocean Park got themed out by CBS, and there was another entity involved with that. Right around the same time, in 57, 58 or so, when Magic Mountain was coming in, but that was an existing park. That was a pier park. We're talking about when these, what I call the knockoff parks, the Disney knockoff parks, these are standalone, meaning they had to put their own infrastructure in. I mean, they had to start from nothing, and they were dealing with some pretty lousy land sites that had to be developed. So anyway, they go up to Golden, Colorado, which God knows why they were building a park up in Denver, to duplicate a Disney thing, because I don't think they had the audience. I know they didn't have the audience up there for it, and that was one of the problems. Is that Wood was telling these guys, his company was telling these investors, they were giving them a couple of really kind of misleading projections. One was the cost estimates, which were really under, they were just way lowballed, all right, as far as realistic numbers to get these parks built. And then they overinflated the number of patrons that would be coming through those gates, by a large margin, something. So it was a problem to begin with, even before the first shovel hit the dirt. And so Marco, that was the beginning of it. And then they went out to Boston. Very similar arrangement. They had another guy out there, a guy named Bill Hawks. He wanted to build a Storyland type of a park out there also. He did connect. We know how he got connected. He got connected through a salesman at a toy show. And so Wood got connected to the Hawks, and one thing led to another, and that was Pleasure Island, and that was the second park that got built across the country. And then the granddaddy of them all, the big guy, Freedomland, which by all accounts was larger, at least in land anyway, larger than Disneyland, the original Disneyland, and that was built in the Bronx. And that opened in 1960, and and all three parks have a very unusual. Every one of them have an individual story. Collectively, they've got a lot of common things that happen to them. But bottom line is, millions of kids got to go to a park that they never would have gone to if they hadn't been there. So we'll give Wood that one.
Even though these parks weren't around for a very long time, particularly Magic Mountain. And for people listening, and all they equate Magic Mountain to is a Six Flags park in California. This is Magic Mountain in Golden, Colorado. And like you said, it borrowed a lot of the theming and elements that you see at Disneyland. What was it that Magic Mountain was setting off to do? I mean, did they really believe that they could make something like that viable in a small Colorado town?
Well, they certainly talked the investors into it. Which, by the way, it was no small money up there. There was roughly $3.5 million worth of stock had sold at $1 a pop and you had to be from Colorado to buy it. And the inflation rate that I've got a stock certificate at my Magic Mountain book. A guy sent me over that his dad had bought 200 shares in 1957. So at $1 today equaling $1 then actually equaling $8.57 today. that 200 shares would cost $1,714 today. That's all wallpaper. That's just people just lost all their dough on that thing. And so they actually they anticipated they were going to get this thing done. It was just that they just didn't have the dough to do it. They brought Wade Rubottom in. Dick Kelsey was brought in by Marco from Disney to a couple of guys that left Disney to design this park. They got the if you looked at the actual layout of the park, the actual rendering, it looked great, but unfortunately they only got about a third of it built, which means 2/3 of it didn't. In the big ride, the river ride, which was basically the equivalent of the jungle ride, they had over $400,000 into that thing, and it cashed out. They never got it done. So they really only they had 6 sections. It was the Calvary Post and Stockade. They got that done. That was the main log buildings. Then they got Centennial City, which was their equivalent of Main Street, Disney's Main Street. And then they've got the fairgrounds. They brought a carousel over from France. They just didn't have the money to put it together. That never got done. The river ride, like I said, didn't get completed. Magic of Industry didn't even get started. And that was going to be for a bunch of exhibitors in there. And Storybook Lane never got started. So, at the end of the day, they opened it up on weekends in '58 while they were trying to sell some stock.
Yeah, they were actually giving tours to people while it was still under construction.
Exactly, while they were building it. Yeah, exactly. And in '59, they actually got the train running. A great train story, but they got the train up and running. They got their, Centennial City was pretty much built out. And then 1960, they finally opened it up for their first and only season. And so 68 days later, Labor Day weekend, it cashed out, and that was the end of Magic Mountain. But the good news is
it
sat there for 11 years, and somebody else picked it up, and they reinvented it into Heritage Square, which just shut down last November.
Now, for someone like me who's not familiar with the area, what did Heritage Square become?
Started out with a guy named Steve Arnold bought it, and he started out. First of all, they put the train back together again. They took the 3-foot train out, and it was a narrow gauge 3-footer, and they replaced it with a 2-footer. And then they took the core buildings that were built for Magic Mountain's Main Street, and they reinvented those in for artisans. So they had leathercraft up there, candle makers. They had the whole shoot match. It was a pretty big deal. They brought tour buses in, and it did really well there for quite a few years. And and they have a small amusement park which is still open. That's not getting knocked down, but everything else is. And it survived for 45 years. So if it hadn't been for Magic Mountain, there wouldn't have been a Heritage Square.
Let's talk a little bit about Pleasure Island. That was the amusement park in the Boston area that hung around the longest of these 3 theme parks. What was the concept behind Pleasure Island?
Well, it started out to be a guy named Bill Hawks, who was a publisher for Child Life magazine up here. He lived up in the Boston area, north of Boston and Gloucester. He wanted to build like I said earlier, he wanted to build a storybook type of a park for kids, recreational, fun, entertaining, that whole thing. And again, he hooked up with Wood. So they developed this concept, and they renamed it from Child Life World to Pleasure Island. And they basically had 2 themed areas. One was the Western section, and that was to tag into all that Western stuff that was going on the day, and TV and movies and stuff, and market it that way. And then Clipper Cove, which was a old New England fishing village, which got them into the water rides. So they ended up with, in the Western section, they had a saloon. It was sponsored by Pepsi, oddly enough. Same sponsors for Disney Saloon out there in California
for
at the
Golden
time.
Horseshoe, yeah.
Exactly. Then they had the narrow gauge train that went around the park. They also had a tilt house, a print shop, a dock ride, which was the Chisholm Trail. That was in the Western section. And then they had on their Clipper Cove, they had a dock ride called the Wreck of the Hesperus, which was really cool. Pretty high tech for this area because we didn't have anything like that before. And then the premier ride was the Moby Dick hunt, and they built 6 authentic wheelboats up in Maine, and they brought these things down, and they weigh out. It was crazy how much these things weighed, and they weren't on any rails. You had 16-year-old kids driving these things with braces out of high school here, and they would bring this thing out, and they took it through a lagoon, and then the 50-foot plastic wheel would come flying out of the water, Moby Dick. which was very, very high tech. That was done by Glenn Robinson out of Culver City.
Yeah, and the comparison you made to it in your book is the Jaws attraction at Universal Studios.
Correct. Exactly. They both weighed 3 tons, and they both had some major problems. And so matter of fact, they couldn't even get Mr. Movie to get, they couldn't get this poor guy working for the first month or so that park opened up. But I interviewed a guy over there, one of the electricians that worked on it. He says that worked great until we put the water in. The problem was the buoyancy was pulling it off the tracks. And they also had another attraction over there called Pirate Cove, and they'd put you in a boat and take you out to they called it an island. It really wasn't. And they had a pirate that would greet you there, and they had a tree house and a bunch of other stuff. And then of course they had the Hood's Barn, and they had a petting zoo over there, and the Showboat where they brought the park evolved over 11 seasons, so a lot of things did happen. But the bottom line is, with all these parks, it was something that you wouldn't get at Coney Island or any of these other parks in the country. What you had was, the stage was everywhere. No matter where you went, there could have been a show. You come around the corner and there's a gunfight. You come around the corner and there's a bank robbery or something going on. So they had all this in-house entertainment going on, throughout the parks, that you weren't even, matter of fact, you wouldn't even get that at Disneyland they didn't have Mickey Mouse, so they had to come up with something else. And they did a really good job at it. And, the kids in those days were so lucky to have this, it's just, you literally couldn't do this sort of thing today anyway.
Mm-hmm. Did the fact that these parks, Pleasure Island and Magic Mountain and Freedomland, the fact that they didn't have a history of intellectual property to draw on, was that kind of a detriment for them?
Well, that and the mere fact that they were bankrupt when they opened up. I mean, that was the biggest thing, and they just couldn't get over the hump. Pleasure Island, every one of them, had their problems. Freedomland, also. Again, they opened up in 1960, and even though this was the biggest out of all the parks, then again, it was the most expensive park. I just figured out the other day, this thing, and with inflation, this thing cost, in those days, it was roughly around $35 million between the building the park and the exhibitors building out their spaces, and that didn't include the land. And today, that would have been worth about $280 million.
Wow!
Which basically went in the dumpster 5 years later. And, and they built this thing. I mean, this thing was huge. It was 85 acres, just the park alone. They built it in the shape of the United States on a 205-acre site, which was tough to find in New York City, but this was just on the outskirts. It was in the Bronx. And
also built on a swamp.
On a swamp, that had been a landfill, and they had a million problems with this thing. And of course, the other thing is that they're dealing with these, just like Walt did. They wanted this thing up and running in a year. They only gave the contractors and the designers 1 year to get these things up, and it was just tight scheduling. Plus, we had to deal with the winters up here, and it was crazy. But they broke Freedomland up into 7 different sections around the country, and they had, you literally walked into little old New York, and they really did this thing up. If anybody gets a chance to Google this stuff up, it's absolutely amazing what they built over there. And then you walked into, little old Chicago, and they actually had a huge building that, the kids would actually put the fire out every hour on the hour with one of those hand pumpers. Then they had the Great Plains, they had buffalo out there. I mean, they took the entire country and themed it down, and they made it out to San Francisco. And, they had this great ride up there, that was the Northwest, Fur Trapper ride. And oddly enough, parts of that, were components of that were shopped out from Magic Mountain because their ride was never going to get completed. So some of that stuff went out here. And then and then you went down into the Old Southwest, and there was just a ton of attractions everywhere you went. New Orleans, that was they had a lot of the not your roller coasters. They didn't have roller coasters in any of these parks, just like Disneyland didn't have. But they had a carousel, and they had 4 or 5 dark rides over at Freedomland. And then Satellite City was the future, and they actually had a huge spaceship. Oddly enough, That was one of the renderings that I have in my Magic Mountain book. A lot of this stuff got transferred from Magic Mountain out to Freedomland. Quite frankly, a lot of those designs and when one thing led to another, and they also went bankrupt, and they went through every one of these parks went through management changes. Pleasure Island had 4 different owners in the 11 seasons it was open. Even Magic Mountain had 2 by the time it even opened up this door. Two different managements, and very interesting concept. Just it didn't quite. Of course, it did make it because eventually all this was gearing up to Six Flags, because these guys, Wood took his team down to Arlington, Texas, and that was the beginning of the whole Six Flags brand, and and then they get, at one point or other, Wood dropped out of that, and Randy Dool, who had been one of the art directors at Pleasure Island up here in Boston that came out of MGM, he was art director for Singing in the Rain and Blackboard Jungle and all that stuff. He got his feet wet over at Pleasure Island, and he went down to Six Flags. He ended up taking that over, and then that's the beginning of the Randy Dool Corporation. Which ultimately ended up designing Magic Mountain out in California.
It's all connected. Obviously, all these properties, had their financial problems. What did Pleasure Island do to hang on as long as it did? It was around for 11 years.
Well, I'll tell you exactly what they did. A couple of the early investors, when they opened this thing up for $59, they were smart enough to buy. They got this thing 20 cents on the dollar. That's how they handled it. So they get rid of a lot of the debt. Of course, the creditors, got a little nailed on it. But anyway, they reopened it in 1960, and they started something that it took Disney for I think it was around the mid 80s by the time Disney got out of went POP, pay one price. But Pleasure Island got it right practically out of the gate. Instead of paying so much, every attraction was ticketed individually. In 1960, they had a pay one price, POP, and so that included all the rides. You could go on as many times as you want to, and all the entertainment. So they basically rebranded a park that was brand spanking new, is what they did with new owners, and they brought the Three Stooges in. So instead of having a lot of their own in-house talent, what they did was they brought in some big name talent and got rid of a lot of the payroll. And when they brought the Three Stooges in, they had 20,000 people show up that first week. The second year they opened up with Chuck Connors. Now I don't know what the hell he did, to be honest with you. I knew he had a rifle. But
he was the rifleman.
Whatever he did.
He also played for the LA Dodgers for a while.
Oh yeah, but I don't know what he did up on the stage. Is what I'm getting at. I know he had a rifle, and we got a picture of him with a rifle on the stage. But he brought in 57,000 people that first week he was there in '61, and then Ricky Nelson opened up in '62. So they brought in a lot of talent in there, and Pleasure Island, according to Billboard, was the 3rd largest grossing park in the country after in those early '60s. And then unfortunately, the town of Wakefield, oddly enough, that's where I live, but that's where Pleasure Island was. They weren't as cooperative as the boys out in Anaheim were, and these guys wanted to do some expansion. They wanted to build a 5,000 seat arena to expand their, to get some more operation, like in the winter months. Anyway, they wouldn't approve it, and one thing led to another. So those owners got out of it. They sold it to some investors. 10 guys pulled some money together, and that was when it did the slide. And they operated that park for the next 5 years, and they sold it to an outfit in 1969 that really wanted the land. By that time the park was trash. Moby was sleeping in the bottom of the pond there someplace, and they ended up cashing out after that '69 season. But they did get 11 seasons out of it, kicking and screaming.
But they managed to struggle through. Now, how did you get involved in studying and researching the history of these parks?
This was a game changer. I went to I was on the planning board in my town. I went to a little church fair looking for a photograph to give one of our planning board members for a going away party. She'd been there for like 9 years. And it was a guy selling postcards at one of the tables, and I was poking around those for a few minutes and came across a package of Pleasure Island postcards. Now, I only went there once, so I don't remember this park hardly at all. And I only would have been maybe 10 or 11 years old when I went. So I had a friend of mine blow these postcards up, and we were posting them on an information station, a couple of them around a lake here in town. And I was poking around the library looking for some information to put a little text to these photographs on the postcards anyway. And came across Disneyland and Marco Engineering and CV Wood, and I'm going like, what, literally. And I was asking people in town, when the park opened up, and they were telling me, 1620 to yesterday. I mean, nobody knew very much about the history of a park that had been here for 11 seasons. So I decided to do some research on it, and one thing led to another. We got a hold of the Hawks family, and then he had a whole bunch of stuff that he had saved while he was putting this whole thing together, and including he was on the board of directors for Freedomland, even had some stuff on Magic Mountain that Wood had handed off to him. So we put a 501(c)(3) together, a friend of mine. And so to this day, we have that whole collection. That whole collection is in a bank vault in a bank right downtown in Wakefield, and we use that for research. Eventually, it's going to get donated to a university that specializes in pulp culture, which gets us to this. What a time period from, when these parks were developed up until 1969. We went from Leave It to Beaver to Woodstock, Mm-hmm. So I think the writing was on the wall the day that these things, they were on the design stage. It just wasn't going to make it, because what came in was all the screamer parks. Kids weren't interested, at a certain point in that time period. Kids were not interested in, they didn't need the education factor. They wanted to go on some fast rides. And these parks weren't designed to have those. I mean, by purpose. It was in print everywhere else. We are not going to build any thrill rides in here.
And I think Freedomland was the one that kind of late in the game put in a roller coaster, correct?
They did at the they started reinventing it after the first season. I mean, they were supposed to get $5 million that first year according to Wood's projections, and they got a little bit over $1 million. As a matter of fact, it's really hard to tell unless you even if you had all the attendance records. They probably got docked it up a little bit, but I don't think they had more than $5 million the whole 5 years they were there. Pleasure Island was supposed to get, they had promised these guys it was supposed to be $750,000, unofficially, the first season. They were they were telling the press it was $1.2 million, and they got about $370,000. So that was their death knell, and then Pepsi and a lot of their exhibitors pulled out of there, and it was a interesting concept, but and then the other factor that they couldn't foresee, or they probably should have foreseen, it didn't really matter. Maybe it did matter, but the land became more valuable than the business. I mean. Mm-hmm. When you think about it, Pleasure Island was a swamp, but now there's over $100 million worth of office buildings sitting on top of that site. Freedomland was a swamp and a landfill, and it was literally doing nothing out there. So they put a park on it, but eventually it became Co-op City and a shopping mall. And Magic Mountain, oddly enough, the subsequent park, Heritage Square, has been a buffer zone between a mining operation, essentially to the left of the park, and to the right of the park is housing. So they've used that Heritage Square as a buffer zone between the mining operation and the housing. And it was just announced just literally a year ago, February. Mark Marietta, that owns the property, decided they were going to nobody was going to be able to get they weren't going to release anybody. No more. All the leases were not going to be renewed. So essentially, most of the buildings are out of there. They had an alpine slide. That's gone. They shut that down last October. I was actually out there. I was out there the last weekend of October, November 1st. It was unusual. I wasn't available to. I wasn't even. I was barely born for the building of these parks, but I certainly got to go to one of them when it cashed out. Let's put it that way. I went on the last train ride, Tim.
Wow.
At Magic Mountain. And I was just out there. I was just literally out there from the 4th to the 8th. We had a bunch of events out there, and my book just came out. It just came out April 25th, so it's pretty darn brand new.
Mm-hmm. Closer to home, you do tours and gatherings on what used to be Pleasure Island.
Correct. We all put our little tinfoil hats on, and we go around and we just make pretend the park is still there. Obviously, everybody knows it's not, but the ponds are still there. You know, the whale is in the water. I mean, that's the ultimate question. Where's the whale? Well, you know, the thing weighed 3 tons, and you know, I don't see it on a miniature golf course down on Cape Cod, so it's probably in the water. And unfortunately, it's all swamp, so it's very difficult to see through you can't see through the water. And
so you can't send a scuba diver down there to check
the
it out?
owners. You know, I brought that up, and the owners of the park, no, they're not interested in having anybody get tangled up. I suppose we could push a car in there. Maybe somebody would have to go in and get it. But no, I think the whale is sleeping. But this piece, I mean, the landscape is still there. And the inner harbor, what we call the inner harbor, the outer harbor. I mean, I can walk. You know, we have an overlay map, so I can tell everybody within a couple of feet where everything is. And I do it a couple of times a year, and we get. You just wouldn't believe how many people and different types of people show up for this thing. And then I do talks, you know, with the local historical societies and, you know, libraries and elevators if somebody wants to listen. I mean, you know, Babel and Bob can keep this thing going forever. And that's just Pleasure Island. But now I've got Magic Mountain and, of course, Freedomland. You know, we're just going to, my head's going to blow up, Tim, honestly.
well, you know, we'll get you on the occasional podcast, too, to talk about all this great stuff. Exactly. Now, you are having a gathering at Pleasure Island on Father's Day. If people in the Boston area want to participate in this, what do they need to do?
Well, what they need to do is just go onto our website, www.friendsofpleasureisland.org, and the little details are right there. It's pretty simple stuff. It's right where the park used to be. It's Edgewater Office Park is sitting right on top of it, right off of 128, exit 42. And everything's free, you know, and there's no reservations, and we just bring your dog, bring your kid, you know, I mean, we've had everybody. It's handicapped accessible. We've had, you know, any number of people. I mean, I've been doing this for 16 years. I can almost do it without not even being there. I mean, that's how cool this is. And then I put together I got about maybe 60 photos from each one of my last 3 books. And by the way, I did my first 2 books were the Arcadia Publishing's Images of America, the traditional black and white, and I did my first one on Pleasure Island for the 50th anniversary, which came out in 2009, and then my Freedomland book in the for the 50th anniversary of that park that came out in 1960. But what I did was I took a bunch of the photos from my last 3 books, which the majority of the photos are in color, and put those in a nice little collage with you know, with some appropriate music. And so I set up a projector and a screen in one of the lower levels of the parking deck at the end of my little tour. And, you know, we all get to see a little show. And I throw a couple of home movies in there, too. And a half a dozen of my baby pictures. No, I'm just kidding.
You know, whatever.
Okay.
Whatever you happen to have lying around, huh?
Okay, whatever.
Exactly. Well, the books Magic Mountain, Pleasure Island, and Freedomland are all part of the Images of Modern America series by Arcadia Publishing. You can find out more about the books by going to arcadiapublishing.com, and I'm sure Bob would appreciate it if maybe you bought a book or 2. I think you'd like that, sir.
Sure.
Bob, got to thank you so much for sharing all of your stories with us today. And thanks for spending time with us today in the Mouse Castle Lounge.
Well, thanks for having me, Tim. Really appreciate it.
And that will do it for this edition of the Mouse Castle Lounge. Thank you to Bob McLaughlin for being my guest. And thank you for your amazing support of Team Mouse Castle. Last month, I asked for your help in earning the Mouse Castle Lounge a People's Choice Podcast Award nomination, and you came through with flying colors. This past weekend, we found out that we made the final nomination ballot in the Society and Culture category, and we are super excited about it. We're going to ask for your help one more time, though. The final voting process relies on your continued support of the Mouse Castle Lounge, so beginning on May 29th, that's this Sunday, and running through June 12th, please go to podcastawards.com and cast your vote for the Mouse Castle Lounge. You're allowed to vote once per day, every day during the voting period. So if you think you can spare a minute or 2 out of your busy schedule and cast your vote for us 15 times over 15 days, it's not as much as you think, we would really appreciate it. Remember, the website is podcastawards.com, and the voting starts on May 29th. Thank you so much for being a part of Team Mouse Castle. Stay up to date with everything going on in the lounge. Subscribe to us on iTunes, Stitcher, or SoundCloud. You can also download the free Mouse Castle Lounge app, which you can get right now by going to themousecastle.com and clicking Get the App. The Mouse Castle Lounge is not affiliated with the Walt Disney Company. I just like to talk about them. I'm Tim Calloway. It's been a blast as always, so let's do this again real soon. Take care.